what's the complaint? And they wouldn't say. Then they said, oh, will you come and talk to the landlord? So I went to the front of the bar and they indicated this chap was the landlord, but he looked about 20, so I don't think he was the landlord. So I said, oh, I hear you have a complaint about us. Can you tell me what it is? And he couldn't.
That sounds very Kafkaesque, as though you've committed a crime, but they can't tell you what the crime
is. Well, that's what I couldn't understand, because, you know, you might... Obviously, they can't tell you who the complainant is, but they should be able to tell you what the complaint is.
GB News, the People's Channel.
Hi there, I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm going to take a second to tell you all about my show, Dubes & Co. We start off with the issues of the day. We then bring in both sides of the arguments. We get rid of the disrespect. And then you throw me into the mix. And trust me, I'll tell it exactly how it is. And then, of course, the magic ingredient, you at home. We mix it all together and what have we got, in my opinion, the best debate show in town. Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
A very good morning to you. Welcome to the Camilla Tominey Show with me, Tom Harwood. We're live at the Conservative Party conference in Birmingham. Now, unfortunately, this weekend, Camilla is unable to be here due to personal family matters. We send her our best wishes, and of course, she'll be right back here next week with a sit-down you won't want to miss, Boris Johnson. Now, throughout the show today, I'll be joined by all 4 remaining Tory leadership candidates and grill them equally over their policies and hopes for the future of the Conservative Party. Well, this is a tight race with all to play for. Could some surprises be in store? Elsewhere, Prime Minister Keir Starmer has had another rough week as fresh allegations have emerged over his fashion faux pas and paid-for getaways. Will this linger over the government? I'll be speaking to the man that some are calling the real Deputy Prime Minister, Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Pat McFadden. And this week, The Spectator alleged that the Ravens are leaving the Tower, with long-term spin doctor of Nigel Farage, Gawain Towler, being dismissed from his post. I'll be speaking to the man behind the charge to professionalise Reform UK, Chairman Zia Yousef. Well, we've got 90 minutes of punchy politics ahead. Don't go anywhere. Well, normally, of course, we would review the papers at this section in the programme, but my goodness me, it's a very packed show. So we're going to kick right off with our first interview. I'm delighted to be joined by the Shadow Home Secretary, Tory leadership candidate and MP for Braintree, James Cleverly. James, thanks for joining us here. Thanks for being first up on this programme. I'm just going to dive straight in. You're a nice guy. Everyone says you're a nice guy. Are you just too nice to be Conservative Party leader?
Well, I wasn't too nice to be Home Secretary, too nice to be Foreign Secretary, too nice to be Chairman of the Conservative Party. When I was Chairman of the Conservative Party, I helped win a record result at the 2019 general election. When I was Foreign Secretary, I was able to completely rebalance UK foreign policy away from Europe towards emerging markets. When I was Home Secretary, I got immigration numbers finally coming down. So there's nothing wrong with being nice, but more importantly, I get stuff done.
Now, talking about getting stuff done, I want to ask if there's something you can say that the Labour Party has done in government that you agree with, that they've done well. Is there anything of the last 3 months you can think of?
I genuinely struggle. They have been such a disappointment. And the lesson we need to take from that is that they went into this general election trying to say as little as possible. They made no commitments. They didn't have a vision. They don't have a philosophy. They don't have a ethos. And therefore, they're lost in government and their behaviour is hypocritical.
Is there really nothing you can find in the entire agenda of this government that you might vote for, that you might be in favour of, even in principle?
Well, look, if West Streeting is genuinely able to reform the National Health Service, I think that's something we should look at. If they are able to drive welfare reform, that's something we should look at. But the fact is, I really struggle. I will look closely, but at the moment they have just been such a massive disappointment.
Now, a lot of people would have said that the last 14 years were equally a fairly large disappointment. Can you name what the most conservative thing the government did was in the last 14 years in power?
Well, I tell you, one of the things that I'm most proud of that I did, working very closely with Ben Wallace, we persuaded NATO ally countries to follow suit when we donated main battle tanks to Ukraine in its self-defense against Russia. I'm very, very pleased that we were the first country to donate anti-tank missile systems, those NLAW missile systems, to Ukraine. So I know the last few years have been very difficult, but there is much that I'm very, very proud of that we did that was staunchly...
But that's your number one answer, giving tanks to Ukraine, of the whole 14 years that your party was in government?
Oh, no, hang on. You asked me for an example. That was an example. The point is, the reason I'm so passionate about making sure we spend 3% of GDP on defence is that if you are not well defended, if you are not able to defend yourself and support your friends and allies around the world, any other plans that you might want to put in place...
A lot of Conservative members might say that defence wasn't a high point of the last 14 years of government.
Well, as I say, my view, and you asked for my view, was that we demonstrated resolve, we demonstrated commitment, and as leader of the Conservative Party and as a future Prime Minister, that's the kind of thing I'd emulate.
Okay.
Doing what is right, not just what is easy.
Okay.
Standing up for peace through strength, rather than just crossing your fingers and hoping.
Now, what was the worst thing the last government did? The most left-wing policy, in your view, that the last government pursued?
Well, I think our collective response to COVID took us into a place that naturally Conservatives should not go. We became much less liberal. The government expanded in its scope and its reach. It took us into some very difficult terrain. And I think we've paid the price for that. And we should learn from that. We mustn't do that again. So whatever response, whether it be to another pandemic or to an economic downturn, cannot be tax and subsidise, restrict and restrain. We need to liberate. We need to liberate businesses, lower tax, less regulation. We need to liberate people, letting them live their lives rather than dictating to them.
Now, this is the last question for looking backwards, but of the last 5 Conservative Prime Ministers, who was the best?
This is great for generating headlines. They all had their strengths and weaknesses. I had a chance to work with all of them.
So surely you should know who's the best.
So the point is, you learn from all of them, but ultimately this is about me putting myself to be a Prime Minister of the UK. So I look at what worked. I look at what worked.
I'm going to press you for an answer. Who
You're
was?
not going to get one.
You're not going to say who was the best.
Because that would it's great for generating headlines, but it's not that useful. So as I say, I've learnt. I've worked closely with them all. I've seen what has worked and what has worked less well. I am thinking about how I would be Prime Minister, how I would prioritise reform of our public services, how I would reduce tax, how I would ease the burden of regulation, how I would liberate people to live their best lives. So I'm looking forward, not backwards.
You've spoken a lot about how you want to cut taxes and reduce spending. Why then do you support a universal welfare benefit for everyone over the age of 65?
Well, the point is, the Labour government has been deeply dishonest about its rationale for doing this. It has done it with no notice and with no mandate. There are constituents in my constituency, there are people in my constituency who relied on that winter fuel allowance to buy their fuel oil for the winter, and they've discovered very, very late, too late for them to do anything about it, they will not be getting it. It's deeply unfair. Now, how we look at supporting older people, there is a legitimate conversation to be had. But lying about the rationale for stripping this at no notice, totally unacceptable, and has put a lot of older people in a very, very difficult place.
Do you think there's a risk here that the Conservative Party starts attacking the Labour Party from the left, saying they're not spending enough, and that becomes the attack of this government? That's perverse.
No, others might, but that's not my attack. The point is, their proposed solution would actually be more expensive, more costly, and the broader point is they were really dishonest. They hid their proposals from the British people through the general election. They claimed they had to do it while simultaneously giving a £9 billion pay rise to their union mates. It's the dishonesty and the hypocrisy which is the real sin here.
Now, you were the first foreign secretary this country has ever had of African heritage. From that perspective, what did you make of what David Lammy had to say at the United Nations earlier this week, talking about his perspective as a black man?
Well, it's all about David, isn't it? I cannot believe the UK Foreign Secretary went to the United Nations in a debate about Ukraine and somehow managed to make it about himself. The Labour Party, I think, are really bruised by the fact that it was the Conservatives who had the first, second and third female Prime Minister, the first Asian Prime Minister, the first black Foreign Secretary, the first Muslim Home Secretary. They hate it because they like that tokenistic identity politics. We just get on with the job. That's all I've ever done. David is desperately trying to make it about identity politics. When I was Foreign Secretary, I made it about UK's national interest on the world stage. That's the difference between saying stuff and doing stuff. I've always focused on doing stuff rather than just saying stuff.
Now, one of the reasons why the Conservatives lost, and this seems to be agreed across the board, is that the party appeared incompetent in government. How do you prove competence in opposition when the most senior elected Conservative with any power in this country is now the Mayor of the Tees Valley?
Well, we've got to recognise that the British people kicked us out for a reason. And they kicked us out because of the gulf between what we said and what we did. So we need to promise less but deliver on everything we promise. And we need to make sure that in the areas where we do still run stuff, whether it be on the Tees Valley or county councils or district councils, that we deliver well, which is why the integration between Westminster and our local government base is so important. How we run our own party is absolutely key. If we act professionally within the party, people will have confidence that the party will act professionally when we get back in.
Just finally, the leadership contest, of course, is determined the week of the US presidential election. Were you an American citizen, would you back Trump or Kamala Harris?
Look, I'm not an American citizen. I've worked with the Trump administration. I've worked with Camilla Harris when she was vice president of the US. As leader of the Conservative Party and as a future Prime Minister, I will make sure I work with whoever the American people choose.
But you won't back either one?
Because I'm not an American, Tom.
Well, there we go. James Cleverly, I tried to get an answer from you on that last one. Ever the diplomat, once a Foreign Secretary, always Foreign Secretary. James Cleverly there, Conservative leadership candidate. Now, coming up next, the Tory leadership candidate Tom Tugendhat will be joining us live at this stand. Stay tuned. Great, thank you very much.
Welcome to State of the Nation, daily plunge into the stories shaping our country. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, and Monday to Thursday we bring you the insights, the facts, the truth about how our country is being governed. Because what happens in Downing Street matters down your street. Tune in to State of the Nation every Monday to Thursday, 8 to 9 o'clock. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Sunday with Michael Portillo from 11, only on GB News.
Professor Frank Furedi has long been recognised for his incisive critiques on contemporary cultural and political issues. In his latest book, titled Why the West Must Fight for Its History, he argues that we are currently facing a profound crisis of identity, exacerbated by the growing trend of historical revisionism. And he joins me now. Welcome to GB News. So would you like to set out, as briefly as possible, the argument in your book?
My argument is basically that increasingly cultural conflicts are about the past, rather than simply about what's going on now. And I became aware of the fact that just about every dimension of our past, our legacy, our cultural achievements, is now being rendered toxic by a systematic attempt to contaminate who we are, where we come from. And to me, that's a very dangerous development. And what's also very dangerous is that all of our cultural institutions, the schools, universities, museums, are going along with this. And there's very little resistance to this whole process. And if that continues, then, in a sense, people growing up in today's world will feel a sense of shame about their nation, about where they come from. Britain did many things over the centuries which we shouldn't be proud of. But when you roll the film backwards and you look at the history of this nation, I think that there is a lot to be proud about. And it's not even a question of balancing good and bad. It's simply having an honest understanding that these achievements, from the Magna Carta onwards, are historically important. You cannot have an idea of tolerance without the contribution of someone like John Locke. You know, you cannot have a sense of technological progress without the Industrial Revolution.
GB News, the People's Channel.
It's Patrick Christie's Tonight, and here we do things differently.
It's explaining the absolute madness of this, doesn't it?
It's explosive.
I mean, this is very good.
It's lively.
850. Your government sat there, Sean, and it did nothing.
It's controversial.
And the Middle East has been in turmoil since before I was born.
It's everything you need to kickstart your evening.
Everyone's had their Weetabix tonight. I love to see it.
That's Patrick Christie's Tonight, weeknights from 9 p.m. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to GB News. You're watching the Camilla Tominey Show with me, Tom Harwood, putting the Tom in Tominey. Well, I'm delighted to be joined now by another Tom Tugendhat, a Tory leadership candidate and the Member of Parliament for Tunbridge. Tom, first of all, thanks for joining us. I'm going to ask one question to kick off. Were you ever in the army?
I may have been, Tom. I may have been. I have to say that's the best intro I've had to Camilla's show. She's an absolute star, but I think putting the Tom in Tominey is the way we need to look at this.
Well, no, marvellous. I mean, the reason I ask the question, of course, is that your campaign focuses heavily on the idea of serving, on the idea of your past in the armed forces. Does it lean too heavily on that?
No, I think it focuses really on leadership, actually. And that's the thing that we've been crying out for in this country. Because look at the challenges that we're facing around the world. Look at the events that you're seeing. You've reported on them in the Middle East. Look at the challenges that we're seeing across Europe. Look at the way that Germany is really struggling today. These are really crises of leadership. These are choices that people have made that are the wrong choices, and we need to make the right choices. We need to invest in our country. We need to build more houses. We need to build more infrastructure. We need to generate cheaper energy. We need to make sure we are leading a conservative revolution in this country that delivers for the British people. That's why I'm focusing on leadership and I'm focusing on trust, because we need to deliver.
Now, all of the other candidates in this race have held senior cabinet posts. You, of course, have been in government, but only attending cabinet rather than being a full cabinet minister. Does it hurt you that you have the least government experience of any of the candidates?
I'm not going to hold against them their lack of experience on the front line in combat. I'm not going to hold against them their lack of experience in serious operational theatres like Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm not going to hold against them their record of the past few years. My job is to set forward my record and demonstrate what I can offer this country. And what I'm championing is the leadership that we need to make sure that this country goes in a different direction.
What do you mean when you say you're not going to hold against them the record of the last 4 years?
Well, I'm not going to. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set
Are you implying that that record was not a good one?
What I'm saying is that we need to look to the future and to the leadership that this country needs. Now, it's for you and for other journalists to judge our record. My job is to make sure we're setting out the leadership for the future. Now, you've already reported on many aspects of the last 4 years. As we both know, what we now need to do is make sure we make the next 4 years different, so that we are actually ready for government in 4 years' time. Because the truth is, just look at what was happening in Liverpool. The reporting from Liverpool demonstrated what we all know. This Labour government is not fit to govern this country. They have demonstrated themselves to be venal, vindictive, and they have demonstrated themselves to have interests that serve themselves, not the British people. Okay. We need to be ready in 4 years' time, because we need a Conservative Prime Minister, and I'm standing to be that Prime Minister.
We're going to briefly look back over the last 14 years. I want you to name the single most Conservative thing the last 14 years of Conservative or Conservative-led government has done.
Education reform. Look at the way in which we trust the British people. When we trust the British people, we get results that transform opportunities for everyone. By trusting teachers, by trusting school parents to choose, we free people, and freedom is the underpinning of...
Isn't it telling that the most Conservative thing of the last 14 years of Conservative government happened during a coalition with the Liberal Democrats?
Well, it happened under a Conservative Prime Minister and with Conservative visionaries. The fact that there were Lib Dems who happened to be watching doesn't actually change the reality. What we need to make sure is we are delivering Conservative policies like that. So we're transforming health, we're transforming energy, we're transforming the infrastructure of our country, and actually building the opportunity for us all.
Now, what was the least Conservative thing that the last 14 years of government oversaw?
Well, it was vaccine passports, and that's why I voted against it. Because, frankly, freedom isn't just in the good times. It's when things are difficult. That's when we need the freedom to challenge, to change, and to have a different perspective on what our country can offer. That's why I have always championed freedom. That's why I've defended freedom, not just here, but I've literally fought on the front line of freedom for our country. And why I've always called out the dictators in Moscow, in Beijing or Tehran who've tried to silence us. And they've sanctioned me for it.
Now, you mentioned vaccine passports, which you voted against. You also voted against the national insurance increase that was brought in and then reversed under the last government. Why do you think, despite these issues, you still have somewhat of a reputation as being on the left of the Conservative Party?
That's really a question for you, Tom. I'm just a Conservative, right? What I do is I champion freedom, I champion opportunity, I champion families, because those are Conservative values. Those are the building blocks of freedom. That's how we achieve the results and the opportunities, and frankly, the growth that this country has been lacking for too many years. Now, I have always said that we need to make sure people keep more of their own wealth. That's why I didn't support the rise in national insurance charges. I'm delighted that the government eventually followed my lead there. And that's why I've also championed full expensing, another policy where businesses can keep the money they invest so they get better productivity.
No, it's true. I mean, you've backed many tax cuts and you were staunch on vaccine passports. You must have an idea about why some of your colleagues think that you're more centrist than others.
Well, I think it's. I think people like the fact that I'm able to talk to people from across the political spectrum, and I'm proud of that. Look, I'm very proud of the fact that I have really, really close friends who used to vote Reform, but who are coming back to support me. I've got really good friends who have supported the Lib Dems, but are coming back to support me. I've got friends who voted Green or Labour. We need to make sure we are making converts, not enemies, and that means making sure we're attracting people who see the Conservative values that we champion and recognise them as their own, whether they used to support Reform or whether they used to support any other party.
Now, you've mentioned a few times in this conversation about building things, building infrastructure, building houses. What do you make of the Labour Party's proposal that they announced last weekend of planning passports, where there will almost be an automatic right to build on brownfield land? In principle, is that a good idea?
Well, in principle, making sure that building has less regulation, that planning has less obstacles to jump through is really important. That's how you give young people the chance to have a home. That's how you give businesses the chance to grow. But let me just tell you one thing, Tom. I have seen so many Labour plans over so many years, and the devil is always in the detail. There is always an element of state control that comes in. Keir's been clear about it. Socialists are clear about it. Socialism means taking control from you and giving it to them.
So no chance you'll back the Labour Party's proposals on planning, even if they're deregulatory?
If they are making real Conservative changes, I'll back them.
An interesting question for someone with a military background. This weekend we've learnt that Boris Johnson was ready to invade the Netherlands in order to retrieve vaccines that, vaccines that the UK had procured but the EU was withholding from us. Good idea or bad idea?
Look, I think two of Boris's best ideas were supporting Ukraine and getting business involved with the vaccine programme so that we got the fastest rollout. I think this reads to me like Boris is having fun with the readers of the Daily Mail.
I've spoken to a special advisor who worked for Boris at that time, who told me it was exactly what happened. That was true. He got military leaders to draw up plans to send in the SAS or other special forces into the Netherlands to retrieve vaccines.
The Netherlands is a very important NATO ally. We train their Navy, we train their Royal Marines. They are a really important ally. It's 400 years since we've been to war with the Dutch, and I think the War of Chatham Docks is really, that's a little bit in the past.
Okay, I was just pushing you hard there, but we're not going to get war with any European Union country from your lips any moment. No, okay.
I'm not announcing the invasion of France.
No, okay. Not even Calais? No, okay. We're going to move on. Of course, the Conservative Party voters split across many different parties at the election. Some went off to the Lib Dems, some went off to Reform, many sat on their hands, and some voted Labour. How do you persuade all of the dissatisfied Tories to come back? How do you find a message that reaches that broader spectrum?
Well, Tom, the truth is I've spoken at constituency events and at public events over the last 10 years. I don't know how many thousand I've done, and over the last 6 months I've certainly done many hundreds, both during the election when I was knocking on doors around the United Kingdom, and then recently, of course, for this phase of the leadership election. And one of the things that really strikes me is the thing that people really want to see is they want to see leadership. They want trust back in politics, and they want to see us delivering. Frankly, they were angry, and I get it. They were really, really angry. What they saw in the Conservative Party Party over the last few years was self-service. They saw us being introspective, not supporting the British people, not looking at what was in the best interest of our country. We need to turn that around. Now, the truth is the Conservative Party does deliver, and we can deliver. And when we champion Conservative values, that's when people come to us, because the natural values of the British people are Conservative. They're based on hard work, on family, on opportunity, and on real drive to make this country better.
Now, you stood to be leader of the Conservative Party 2 years ago. Why do you think you didn't win? Why didn't the party vote for you?
Well, I think there are many, many reasons why the party was in a different position then. We were actually in government, and we saw shenanigans and game playing resulting in 2 elections in a very short space of time. I'm here to end that game playing. We've had enough of the political games that have made this party, frankly, more of a Westminster club than a national movement. We need to get back to being a national movement that champions the values of the British
But you
people.
didn't win then. Why can you win now?
Because this is a different election. What we're now talking about is reforming the Conservative Party, making sure we clean up CCHQ, we change the way that this party works so that we can change the way that this country works. That's what we've got to do. That's what I'm going to do, so that in 4 years' time, the British people will have the chance to vote for either a socialist who's already started destroying Britain or a Conservative who's ready to rebuild it. I'm standing to be Prime Minister in 4 years' time.
You've mentioned the freedom-loving ethos of this party, of the British people. Should people who protest politicians, who wave placards that call politicians of colour coconuts, should those people be arrested for the placards they hold?
Look, I've always been clear that when politics is free, you can say what you like. When you're seeing the incitement to racial hatred that you've sometimes seen, then that is simply wrong. Now, the judge has ruled on this, and I'm not going to second-guess the judiciary. But frankly, I think racism in public life is utterly vile. It degrades everybody. Mostly it degrades the person who's doing it. But it's frankly absolutely despicable that we've seen people using such racial epithets across this country, and it's absolutely wrong.
Some might say that a Conservative peer, Baroness Varsi, no longer a Conservative peer, was removed from the party for free speech. What do you make of that charge?
No, she was removed from the party for repeating racist slurs.
Finally, and this is a question that, of course, all of the candidates were asked famously in 2019. It's a question that Keir Starmer has studiously avoided answering. I hope you can answer it now. Have you done any illegal drugs in your past?
I'm afraid not, no. I did handle an awful lot of opium when I was a soldier in Afghanistan, but I'm afraid that was to burn it, not to use it.
Well, Tom Tugendhat, thank you so much for joining us here on the Camilla Tominey Show. I really appreciate your time. Now, coming up, I'm going to be joined by the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Pat.
GB News Breakfast, every day from 6 a.m.
And we've got a treat, not only to have you here, but you've brought loads of exclusives for us this morning.
Well,
your chat with Robert Jenrick.
Just for you, Ellie. Yeah, Robert Jenrick, of course, is the front runner to be Tory leader.
He is now, yeah.
Amongst Tory MPs, yeah. And he's been talking to us for my podcast, Chopper's Political Podcast, about immigration, about criminals being released from prison. Also, really importantly,
most importantly, some would say.
Yeah, biscuits. Now,
biscuits.
He was, I should explain to viewers, Robert Jenrick during the COVID pandemic had to pull together a hamper of goods for those isolating, and he put in a special biscuit.
Yes.
Here's what he had to say on the podcast.
Before we move on to the future and what your plans are, your biggest achievement in government, what do you reckon it was? I know what it was.
Well, you go first.
Yeah, custard creams.
I thought you were going to say that I saved a penny. It was another one of our campaigns, yeah.
But custard creams, briefly. I mean, you were the community secretary. You had to provide food boxes during the COVID pandemic. And what did you put into those food boxes?
Custard creams, the people's favourite biscuit.
What else is there?
The people's favourite biscuit. Now, across the country...
Yes,
well,
Aidan.
Coffees are being dropped across the country.
Yeah,
is that really the people's favourite biscuit, Aidan?
Listen, you'll never change my opinion. I like shortbread, but I like it homemade. With a sprinkling of sugar. Listen, I'm type 1 diabetic. I had to be quite moderate in terms of my intake, but goodness me.
I mean,
a nice cup of tea.
that's a good one.
It's about the shape as well. If you show, some more intelligent biscuit companies, they will make shapes of biscuit that fit into the tea. But it's nothing worse than when you put it into a narrow cup and it won't
go in, will it? You can't hit the...
So you like the triangular...
Not really triangular.
Fingers.
Just something a bit elongated that I can turn sideways and dip in like that.
Got you.
GB News, the People's Channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. Now, so much more to come in the next hour. I'll be joined by the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, someone who many people call the real Deputy Prime Minister, Pat McFadden, and Tory leadership hopeful Kemi Badenoch, alongside Robert Jenrick. But first, here's the news with Lewis Mackenzie.
Thank you very much, Tom. Good morning. It's 10 o'clock. I'm Lewis Mackenzie here in the GB newsroom. The Conservative Party conference begins in Birmingham today, as the party chair, Michael Winstanley, is expected to say he is profoundly sorry for the loss at the general election. Leadership hopefuls James Cleverly, Robert Jenrick, Tom Tugendhat and Kemi Badenoch will also be making their bids to be the next leader. Former British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak says, and his wife Akshata Murthy arrived last night, but are expected to leave later on today. It will be his last conference as leader. Canterbury MP Rosie Duffield has resigned the Labour whip, accusing the Prime Minister of hypocrisy and pursuing cruel and unnecessary policies. In a resignation letter, Miss Duffield attacked Sir Keir Starmer's decision to keep the 2-child benefit cap and means test winter fuel payments, and condemned his handling of the outcry over gifts given to him and other senior Labour figures. David Lammy has spoken to the Lebanese Prime Minister following a series of Israeli airstrikes in Beirut. The Foreign Secretary says they agreed that an immediate ceasefire is required to bring an end to the bloodshed. It comes after the terrorist group Hezbollah confirmed their leader, Hassan Nasrallah, was killed in an airstrike in southern Lebanon. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says Israel settled the score with Nasrallah's death, and it is a historic turning point, while President Joe Biden says his death is a measure of the justice for his many crimes. The Lebanese Health Ministry is reporting that at least 33 people have now been killed and 195 wounded in the attacks in central Beirut. Almost 10 million households have been warned they risk overpaying for their energy if they don't send meter readings to their supplier before the 10% price rise takes place on the 1st of October. The average household energy bill is set to increase by £149 a year from this Tuesday as Ofgem increases the price cap. The cleanup has begun after Hurricane Helene swept through the southeastern part of the United States. Leaving at least 64 people dead and millions without power, Helene was one of the most powerful storms ever to have hit the region. Wild weather has also devastated Nepal, with more than 100 killed and 64 missing as flooding and landslides hit the capital. Rain began pouring down on Friday night and continued into Saturday, with low-lying neighbourhoods in Kathmandu inundated with surging floodwaters. It's the highest recorded rainfall there since 1970. Philip Schofield says the utter betrayal by his television colleagues has made him never want to be a daytime presenter ever again. The 62-year-old former This Morning host is set to appear on Channel 5's Castaway, marking his first TV appearance since leaving ITV in May of 2023, following an admission of an unwise but not illegal affair with a younger male colleague. And SpaceX has launched its mission to bring back 2 astronauts who have been stranded on the International Space Station since June.
3, 2, 1, ignition, full power, and liftoff.
The Dragon capsule, which has 2 empty seats for Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams, lifted off from Cape Canaveral last night. The pair were only meant to be in space for around 8 days, but after a fault was found on their return vehicle, the new Boeing Starliner, it returned to Earth empty, just as a precaution, leaving them stranded for almost 4 months. The new team is hoping to bring them back in February of next year. Well, those are your latest GB News headlines. I'm Lewis Mackenzie. More from me in an hour.
For the very latest GB News direct to your smartphone, sign up to News Alerts by scanning the QR code or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show with me, Tom Harwood. Lots still to come. In a minute, I'm going to be joined by the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Pat McFadden. I'll also be joined by Kemi Badenoch, the Tory leadership candidate, and the only woman left in the fight. Also, Robert Jenrick will be here, as well as Zia Yousef, the chairman of Reform UK. Now, much to come. We're going to hear now from the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Labour MP for Wolverhampton and South East, Pat McFadden. Pat, thanks so much for joining us on the programme. First of all, you are 3 months into the job and you've all lost one of your members of Parliament. Rosie Duffield resigned last night. What went wrong?
Well, I think when you read Rosie's resignation letter, you can see that these are the frustrations and disagreements of somebody who's held them for quite a long time. There's no secret about that. I think Rosie's been quite disaffected with the Labour leader, with the Labour Party for quite a while. So I'm disappointed to see her go because I like Rosie and I think she's got a lot to offer politics. But ultimately, I'm not surprised.
Pat, you say that these are questions that she's had for a long time, but the freebies scandal has only been running for the last few weeks. I've got her letter here. In it, she says the sleaze, nepotism and apparent avarice are off the scale. She says inexplicably accepting expensive personal gifts of designer suits and glasses costing more than most of those people can grasp is an entirely undeserving of Keir Starmer holding the post of Prime Minister. This is a recent scandal.
Well, she does say that, you're right, but this is part, it's a campaign donation. It's part of presentation, it's part of a campaign, and that's what this was. And, you know, I welcome the support of Lord Ali, who gave this campaign donation, and of the other successful people who support Labour. He's supported Labour for a long, long time. He's given this campaign donation. Presentation is part of the campaign. That was for then. Now that we're in government, we're in a new phase.
Presentation is certainly part of all campaigns. Presentation, i.e. how things look, really, really matters. And isn't Rosie Duffield's point here that this all looks terrible? That you have members of Parliament, incredibly wealthy members of Parliament, the leader of the opposition accepting more than £100,000 in gifts over the last Parliament. That's the presentation that she's concerned about.
Yes, and she's acknowledged this morning that people do raise funds for campaigns. She's raised funds for her own campaign. Every politician does this. That's what some of this was. Some of the rest of what you're talking about there is a lot of it's hospitality following his football team. There are security reasons for that. He can't just sit in the stand. And that's what accounts for most of what you've read out there.
Of course, Rishi Sunak did sit in the stand. He didn't take the director's box. But do you think that all of these issues have been the reason why, in the latest opinion poll, Keir Starmer's rating is now below that of Rishi Sunak? And let's not forget, Rishi Sunak is the man who led the Conservative Party to their biggest defeat in the party's history. How on earth is our Prime Minister now polling worse than that?
Well, I'll be more interested in the polls 3 months before an election than 3 months after them. We've been elected with a big majority. We've got a lot of work to do. We've got a big and difficult legacy from the Conservative Party to work through. And when we've done that, we get on with stabilising the economy, getting growth going, generating the wealth that we need for our public services, turning around the NHS and making sure that living standards rise all around the country. That's the agenda that I and my cabinet colleagues are working to every day. yes, we've had a few difficult headlines,
Pat,
which you've read out.
You used to work...
and, you know, I'm not saying I don't wish these stories had taken place, but we'll get through it, and we've got a big agenda for the future.
But you used to work for Tony Blair, who was known as the master of spin. Of course, there was only 1 point during his first term in office where he even dipped behind the Conservatives, and that was the fuel crisis. I mean, really, the first few months, even the third month, fourth month, the first year, the first 4 years that Tony Blair was in position, he never dipped below William Hague in terms of favourability. The party never fell behind the Conservatives apart from at one moment during a national crisis. I mean, there's no comparison. Clearly, there is something going very wrong with the operation of Number 10.
Well, it's interesting you raise the Tony Blair era, and you're right. I used to work for Prime Minister Blair, and as your viewers can probably tell, I've been around the block a little bit when it comes to politics. I think there's a bit of rose-tinted spectacles in looking at the past sometimes. I remember a lot of stories about divisions then. I remember a big story about a Bernie Ecclestone donation, you might remember, which felt like quite a crisis at the time. And the important thing is that we
felt like a crisis, but it didn't dip his poll numbers in the way that Keir Starmer's poll numbers have dipped. And perhaps, Pat, what I'm getting at here is that despite things being thrown at Tony Blair, his poll numbers didn't dip because he had a competent operation. He had strong spinners. He had, he had a smooth operation behind Number 10. Whether you agreed with him or not, people always knew he seemed competent. That seems very different now when you've got briefings between figures behind the scenes in Number 10. Sue Gray, the Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister, her salary was leaked by someone within Number 10. So now we know that she earns more than the Prime Minister. The story is less that the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff earns more than him. It's that someone else in that building leaked that to the media. You're fighting like rats in a sack.
Well, it's interesting you should praise the spinners of the past. As I say, I remember this well because I was there, and they were always being attacked at the time. The spin was too much. People didn't like spin. They didn't like having strong briefers. You appear to be calling for a return of the strong spinners. I don't want to blame any of the government's recent difficulties on staff. I don't think politicians should do that. I don't think it's fair. We'll work our way through these things. We've got a big agenda to work on. I outlined some of that to you a few minutes ago. We've got a big important budget coming up in a few weeks' time. We've got an investment conference coming up. We've got legislation on rights for renters, on transport, on GB energy, hereditary peers, a big legislative programme. That's what we're working on, and that's what we're going to get on with.
And yet it's all being distracted, of course, because it looks like the people at the top of government are more concerned about designer suits, expensive glasses, and really having their snouts in the trough rather than getting on and governing. I hate to bring it up because this, of course, has been in the news in previous years, but you yourself rented out a house in your own constituency, the house that you used to live in order to then rent a house next door to that and charge the taxpayer for that rent. Of course, it was within the rules at the time, but many people said that that was against the spirit of the rules. Are you not equally guilty here?
No, that was in order to comply with the rules, because they changed the rules and said you could no longer have a mortgage subsidised by the taxpayer, but you had to rent. And so I complied with the rules. It's very important to comply with the rules.
You could have paid the mortgage yourself.
Profit, the property was sold.
The rules
at a
didn't say
loss,
that you couldn't pay the mortgage
and
yourself.
So I've always complied with the rules and taken those seriously.
But you could have paid the mortgage yourself, and instead you didn't. You rented out the house and then charged the taxpayer to rent a second property.
Well, it's in the parliamentary system that MPs will live in two places. I do pay a mortgage by myself on my own home. Of course I do, like anyone else. But it's in the rules that MPs live in two different places. And in that second place, there is a home that is paid for out of the rules, and I've always complied with the rules in the way that is done, and I'll make sure I do that in the future too.
Yes, as with all of these stories, no one is suggesting rules have been broken. People are suggesting it looks like there are issues with finance and with greed. That's the public perception, frankly. Pat, just one final question. Would you accept Rosie Duffield back into the Labour Party?
Well, I think it's probably a bit too soon to be raising that prospect given the anger with which she has left. I regret Rosie going because I like her and I think she's an important voice in politics.
But not a yes and not a no.
Has been known for a very long time, and so while I'm disappointed, I'm ultimately not surprised at the decision that she's taken.
OK, Pat McFadden, thank you so much for joining us here on GB News. Really appreciate your time this morning.
Thank you.
Now, in just a minute, I'll be speaking to Tory leadership candidate Kemi Badenoch. I'll be asking her whether she thinks there's been a Stop Kemi campaign in this contest. Back in 2 minutes.
Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg's State of the Nation, Monday to Thursday from 8 p.m.
One of the most eminent constitutional experts, Sir Vernon Bogdanor, has published his latest book, Making the Weather, 6 Politicians That Changed Modern Britain, covering 3 eminent figures on the left, Nye Bevan, Roy Jenkins and Tony Benn, as well as 3 on the right, Enoch Powell, Keith Joseph and Nigel Farage. We began by discussing the latter, the newly elected Member of Parliament for Clacton and leader of the Reform Party. I started by asking him how Nigel Farage has had such a fundamental effect on British politics.
Well, it's not difficult to underline Nigel Farage's effect. He's partly, perhaps largely, responsible for Brexit, which, whether one's in favour of it or not, is the most consequential foreign policy decision we've made since the war. And he's also, I think, largely responsible for destroying 3 Conservative Prime Ministers, David Cameron, Theresa May and more recently Rishi Sunak. How's he done it? I think the answer's quite simple. He's a brilliant communicator. And that, in a way, is the first task of a politician, to be a communicator. The first task of an academic is to teach and write books. The first task of a politician is to be able to communicate. And sad to say, neither Keir Starmer nor Rishi Sunak, whatever their other virtues, are very good communicators. So I think that's the reason for his success.
And Nigel's always been very good at communicating a complex issue through a simple message, and that has resonated with the people that he's trying to influence.
Absolutely. He speaks to people with language they can understand. He doesn't use language they can't understand, like missions or strategic aims or management speak, which has really taken over both of the major parties, I think, frankly.
GB News, the People's Channel.
The king of breakfast TV is back. That's right. Britain's favourite TV host, Eamon Holmes, returns to Britain's hottest breakfast programme. Breakfast every day from 6 a.m. Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
If you want your news to be straight talking...
This is the nightmare for the Conservatives again.
Down to earth.
It's not just Nottingham where this is happening, is it?
And most importantly, honest.
Hard-working, middle-class taxpayers, they'll get their book thrown at them.
Then catch me, Martin Daubney, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens.
With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK.
We're ready to keep you up to date with what's happening every half an hour, every single day. Bulletins here on GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel. Okay. Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show with me, Tom Harwood. We're live on GB News. Now, I'm delighted to be joined here in Birmingham at the Conservative Party conference by Kemi Badenoch, Tory leadership candidate and the Member of Parliament for North West Essex. Kemi, thank you so much for joining us here this morning. First of all, I'm going to dive straight into it. You pride yourself on how direct you are. You pride yourself on speaking hard truths. But do you worry that you won't make the final two because you've rubbed too many of your parliamentary colleagues up the wrong way with that same directness?
No. If you look at who's supporting me, you'll find that the people who've worked with me the most are my supporters. If I was rubbing people up the wrong way, it wouldn't be them. All the ministers who worked in my department are supporting my leadership. I think that people want some directness now. People want to hear politicians speak their minds rather than hide behind waffly language. And the thing about me rubbing up colleagues the wrong way is not true. It's something put about by people who are competing against me. I get on with my colleagues.
Now, of course, there is a yellow card system in this race where if candidates or camps directly brief against other candidates, they're told to stop. Do you think this has been a clean race?
I think it has been very interesting where some candidates have set out their stall and other candidates are talking about everybody else. I mean, it was really interesting on the Laura Koonsberg show today. Rob Jenrick was on just before me, and he said two things about me that weren't true. One, that I've said that numbers don't matter. Numbers do matter when it comes to immigration. I said so in an op-ed, and that I'm opposed to a cap. I'm not opposed to a cap. I just think that you can have a cap and the wrong people still come in. I want us to talk about who is coming into our country.
Do you think that Robert Jenrick's campaign should have a yellow card put against him for those comments this morning?
Do you know what? I think that whenever people do things that are, about other candidates, people can see. So I'm just focused on my own campaign. It's for the party authorities to decide. I'm very happy to correct the record, but it shows that he's not actually reading or listening to what I'm saying.
Now, would you serve in Robert Jenrick's cabinet or any other of your potential, anyone who might win this contest, would you serve in any of their cabinets, in any position?
Yes, and that is because I would certainly serve in the cabinets of any of the contenders standing, because we need to make sure that we all pull our weight when it comes to this parliament. There are only 121 Conservative MPs. We are so few. We're going to need everybody to work harder if we're ever going to get back to government.
Now, this is something I'm asking everyone. What is something that you can name that the Labour government has done well so far in their first 3 months in office?
Something Labour's done well. You asked this. I actually was thinking about this the other day because I like to give people the benefit of the doubt. And there is nothing that they have done well. Winter fuel payment, two-tier care on policing, treating one group differently from another, stripping away Ofsted inspections. Parents don't know what's going on with schools. Taxing VAT, taxing education. I know a hairdresser who's taking her daughter out of private education because it's just too much. This Labour government are terrible because they have no principles. They're just doing things without thinking. We were not ready for the election. They were not ready for government.
Now, you have prided yourself on your principles and you've stood for the leadership beforehand. One of the things that you said in the past was that it is ridiculous that the state takes money from working taxpayers and gives it in benefits to millionaires who are retired.
Yes.
Is that not then a good thing that the Labour Party is doing in means testing winter fuel allowance?
But it's not really means testing. They're just taking it away from anyone who doesn't have pension credit. Millionaires should not be getting the winter fuel payments, but there are many more people who are in poverty or who are just about managing, who need it. But the other reason why I'm opposed to it happening the way they've done it is because government has made energy more expensive. The US's energy is half the cost of ours. We add levies, we make it expensive, so we should protect those people who can't work, who need the winter fuel payment. Let's means test it better.
Now, one of the reasons why American energy is half the cost, or even less than that in the United Kingdom, is they extract their shale gas. Do you think we should start fracking in the United Kingdom?
You asked, this is a very controversial question, Tom, because you will remember that the fracking vote was the vote that brought down Liz Truss's government.
Despite the vote passing.
Yes, indeed, but it was very controversial. I think that if we are going to do something like fracking shale gas, we're going to need the public to buy into it, and they're not there. They're not yet there yet. I am personally not opposed to it, but I wouldn't be starting out putting out policies there because I know that the communities don't want it, and we have to work with a lot of communities in order to do difficult things.
Now, of course, you shadow Angela Rayner. You've had some pretty punchy performances across the dispatch boxes to and from one another. I want to ask you specifically about a policy that the Labour Party proposed last weekend. It looks like they're pushing ahead with it. It's pretty radical, planning passports where you will automatically be able to build on brownfield land. I mean, does that not sound like something that you've been advocating, the idea of building more in our cities and potentially less on green fields?
It sounds like a good idea, but if you actually look at the detail, that's not actually what they're proposing. What they're proposing is, well, should we ask people, maybe, perhaps in certain circumstances we might do this, but we're not going to override local consent. We're not going to do, there's so many caveats to it. It is not serious when you realize that they have given urban areas lower housing targets. They're lowering the housing targets for places like London. So they're not going to achieve that. They are not consistent. That policy that they put out is not coherent. If you read it, you can see it's all over the place. And this is what I was explaining to Angela, who I actually quite like as a persona. She is one of those people who just hates Tories. I'm not somebody who hates people because of their political beliefs. I quite like her persona.
Does she hate all Tories?
Well, she called us scum, so I think that's pretty visceral, and she's never really apologized for it, at least not to my knowledge.
Right.
But she doesn't understand the policy. When she's standing there, she's reading a script that somebody else has written for her. When I ask questions, she answered different questions.
There's something you said at the beginning of that answer, criticising the Labour Party's policy because it doesn't override local consent enough. Would your ideal policy override local consent?
Well, that's the point I'm making, is that if you're going to have automatic brownfield development, then that means you're overriding local consent.
Right.
If they've put that in there and said we're not going to do that, then it's not really automatic. That's why I say the policy is not coherent. There's lots of stuff in there that just doesn't add up.
OK, we're going to move on to international affairs now. Would you vote for Trump or Kamala Harris?
I'm not an American citizen, and I never answer this question. I used to when it was a pub quiz, but as somebody who's been trade secretary and met people from all parties in other countries, they don't like it when we comment on their internal politics. I'm not a junior politician anymore. I'm not just, having a fun time on a Sunday show. I'm running to be leader of my party, and that means that I need to be able to work with whoever is leading the, countries that are our allies, and that may be Donald Trump. That may be Kamala Harris. I respect them both, and I would work well with them.
The Prime Minister has been at the United Nations in New York this week. He's met with Donald Trump. He dined with Donald Trump in a quite intimate setting. I almost said romantic there, but I think I should probably row back from that. David Lammy has been speaking at the UN as well. You're a very senior politician of African heritage. I want to ask you what you made of David Lammy's speech at the UN, where he spoke about his own personal experiences as a black man.
I didn't think that the comments were serious. I could tell that he was very passionate, but I would draw the wrong analogy. Sometimes we need to be able to say things are wrong on principle, not just on our personal experience. There's often a place for personal experience, but the war that Russia is waging in Ukraine violates so many moral principles. Obviously, he's well within his rights to use that analogy. It's not one that I would personally use. But David Lammy is somebody who has repeatedly, made remarks that he's had to row back on. So I don't think that he's as good a foreign secretary as David Cameron or even James Cleverly was. We need Conservatives doing these jobs. And I just think overall, Labour are hypocrites. You talked about Keir Starmer meeting Donald Trump intimately, but you look at the things they've been saying over several years. They acted as if Donald Trump was Satan. Now, all of a sudden, he's their best friend. That is why I'm careful when I answer these questions, because I know in the future I will have to work with these people. Saying silly things on Twitter to get likes is not serious politics. The Labour Party are not a serious party.
Now, you've been a staunch supporter of freedom of speech for many years. There has been an issue this week that has involved freedom of speech. A Conservative peer, a formerly Conservative peer, now independent peer, has resigned from the party pending an investigation because she said it was wrong people waving placards that had the word coconut on them were arrested. She said that you should be able to call a politician, in effect, a coconut. What do you make of that? Is that free speech? Or is that not okay?
The term is a racial slur. And I think that no politician should be justifying the use of racial slurs. There is a different argument about whether we should imprison people for this, but the law at the moment means that if you call me the N-word, you will probably, go to prison. We should not make different rules for people based on what group they're in. And that was effectively what that court case was doing. There are other court cases that have ruled differently. I think this is a space that we need to explore more. But no Conservative politician should be justifying the use of racial slurs. That is why the whip was removed from her. She has, and she is jumping before she's been pushed. There were numerous complaints about that Conservative peer. And I think the right decision was made by the party.
Clear for you, a party matter of ideology rather than a legal matter of imprisoning people for what they say?
Well, I think it's both. We have created all sorts of legislation that is now a mess. We have non-hate crime incidents that police report. This is one of the things I'm afraid that we did badly in government. We should not. I think it came in under the Theresa May era. We keep legislating for the left. This is why people are upset with us. We talk right, we govern left. We need to be very clear about free speech and its boundaries, not blur the law to the point where the police don't know who's doing something wrong and whether they're going to get in trouble if they arrest this person but not that person. Equality under the law is a key principle.
You've mentioned that as a very clear thing that you think the last government got wrong.
Yes.
Over that 14 years, what do you think the thing they got most right was?
We got a lot right. We don't talk about it enough. Early on, certainly under David Cameron, what we did in education was fantastic. Labour's already rowing back on that. The education standards that we brought in, you can compare with SNP-run Scotland and Labour-run Wales. England has shot up international rankings. Wales has gone backwards. Scotland, so far backwards, they don't even want to publish the figures anymore. Or perhaps it's the other way around. But that is a clear example of where Conservatives in government deliver opportunity for people.
Now, in the Telegraph today, I think, you've written, if necessary, we will leave international frameworks like the ECHR. This is an article where you're talking about controlling illegal migration. Is that not a bit weaselly language? If necessary, we will leave international frameworks like the ECHR. That's Rishi Sunak's policy.
I'm not sure that it is his policy, but what I'm saying...
Rishi Sunak, as Prime Minister, said he wouldn't commit to leaving the ECHR, but said that nothing was off the table, he would leave it if necessary. Is that not your policy?
Yes, that is my policy. But the point I'm making is that we're not in government. So whether we want to leave the ECHR today, it's not going to matter. The problem we have, and this is what is different between me and Rob, the problem we have is that the public don't trust us. It doesn't matter if we throw out 1,000 great promises. People don't believe we will do them because we didn't do them before. How do we earn that trust back? That's why I wrote that numbers matter, but culture matters even more. And leadership is the critical thing. If the Prime Minister is not personally driving it, it won't happen. But the other thing that I say is that even if we left the ECHR today, we still wouldn't be deporting people. There are countries in the ECHR that are deporting more than us. That is a culture problem. We have people in the Home Office who don't want to do this work.
Okay.
If it doesn't matter what frameworks you leave, if you can't get the people to do the job, you're wasting your time. I am an engineer, so I think about how to make the system work. Rob is a lawyer. He's going to talk about laws and legalese. My way will work. His is another promise.
OK, I've got so many more questions I'd like to ask you, but I've only got time for one. In a word, if you would, is it good for your campaign now that your supporter, Michael Gove, is the incoming editor of The Spectator?
Michael Gove is not running my campaign. I'm running my campaign. I don't know what he's going to be like at The Spectator. I will miss Fraser Nelson, who was a good colleague when I worked there. I used to work for Andrew Neil at The Spectator about 10 years ago. So I care very much about that magazine. It is an important voice for the centre-right. We need more Conservative voices and
a good thing or bad thing?
I don't know. We will have to wait and see. We shouldn't judge people before they start a job. Let's see what he does.
OK, Kemi Badenoch, thank you so much for joining us here on the Camilla Tominey programme. Really appreciate your time. Coming up next, I'm going to be joined by the chairman of the Reform Party, Zia Yousef. Stay with us.
Good morning, welcome to your GB News weather update from the Met Office. It's going to be wet and windy in the west today with outbreaks of heavy rain and strong winds, but generally drier in the east with some hazy sunshine. But it's a chilly start to the day, especially where we've seen some clear skies but bright skies to start, especially across Scotland and across eastern parts of England. But further towards the west, we have an area of low pressure that's bringing in some strong gusty winds, and the Met Office have got a yellow wind warning in force for Wales and the southwest of England, so expect gusts of 50 to 60 miles per hour. Mild here though, but probably unpleasant, feeling pleasant enough in the sunshine further east you go. So through Sunday evening then, we've got heavy spells of rain and a rain warning that will also come into force later. So heavy spells of rain, especially over the highest ground of Devon, Cornwall and also Wales. Turning cloudy across Northern Ireland with further spells of rain here, but generally dry across parts of Scotland with some clear skies to go into Sunday evening. But for many of us, it's going to be turning increasingly unsettled, with outbreaks of rain continuing to push their way north and eastwards, coming into much of Wales, into the Midlands, and then in towards the southeast of England. So like I said, we do have a Met Office rain warning in force, so expect further flooding and some difficult driving conditions as well. But that will lead to a mild night, with many places seeing largely cloudy skies. And we also still hold on to some strong winds, especially towards the south and west as we start Monday morning. But Monday looks generally unsettled for a lot of us, with outbreaks of rain and a lot of cloud around. So unsettled across parts of Scotland, Northern Ireland as well, and then heavy spells of rain wrapping around this low pressure system, drier as we go later on in the southwest.
Mark Dolan tonight is your weekend dose of news, debate and entertainment. This sounds like a wild conspiracy theory. Don't miss My Big Opinion, Mark Meets, and My Take at 10. Democracy is a funny old thing. And we don't do boring, not on my watch. I just won't have it. Let's go and get another glass of that bubbly. You've earned it. That's Mark Dolan tonight, Saturday and Sunday, 9 to 11, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Are the newspapers getting you down?
My wife didn't divorce me that month.
Struggling to separate the wheat from the chaff?
I know that it's a bit of a circus at the best of times.
Well, don't worry, Headliners has got you covered. We'll take the burden of reading the day's news, and if we get depressed, who cares? It's an occupational hazard, frankly. That's Headliners on GB News from 11 p.m. till midnight, and the following morning, 5 till 6 a.m. on GB News, the comedy channel. Nah, just kidding. Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show on GB News with me, Tom Harwood, putting the Tom in Tominey. Now, I'm delighted to be joined by the chairman of Reform UK, Zia Yousef. Zia, it was only a week ago that we were in Birmingham, a different part of Birmingham, for your party's conference. This week, the Conservatives are convening. The Conservatives here think that they can defeat the Labour Party in the next 4 or 5 years and become the government. But speaking to people at your conference, speaking to or hearing people on stage at your conference, you believe you can win the next election. With 5 MPs now, getting up to 326, is that a realistic possibility?
Tom, there's a big elephant in the room at that conference, which is that the Tories are done. The British people now see the Tory party for what they are, which is a party that will say absolutely anything to get themselves elected and then do the complete opposite when they come into power. If you just look at their record, I mean, people at home listening to these Tory leadership hopefuls must be shaking their heads in disbelief at how shameless it is. They promised in manifesto after manifesto to bring net migration down to the tens of thousands, left office having exploded the size of the population, with that number at 750,000. They promised to reduce taxes. Supposedly they're the party of low taxes. They left office having raised the tax burden on hard-working British people to the highest level since the Second World War. They presided over a knife crime epidemic that leaves many people watching this programme too afraid to go to their local shop. They allowed wokery to run rampant throughout all the great British institutions, including and especially our civil service. They have a huge amount to answer for. I'm amazed, frankly, that they're able to say these things with a straight face. The last hopeful we just heard on your programme a moment ago was most of what she was saying was criticising her own government's record. things like non-crime hate incidents, which is a wonderful but awful example of the catastrophes that the Tories inflicted on this country. The British people see them for what they are. They betrayed every principle that their voters elected them to uphold, and they're going to be consigned to the history books as a result.
Do you think that the government that is currently in place, the Labour government that got in on a historically low share of the vote with a historically high number of members of Parliament, partly because of the success of Reform UK and parties like it, do you think they'll be better or worse?
Well, they're demonstrably worse, but all Labour are the Tories on fast forward. You know, both parties essentially want to leave our border open, want to have no controls or sensibility or intelligence about the migration policy, preside over a knife crime epidemic because they're too cowardly to stop it quickly using stop and search, which we know works. Both parties are allowing our health service to continue to fall into disrepair to the point on being on the brink of collapse. So look, clearly Keir Starmer is worse, but I would go back to the point, given this interview is about the Tory conference, and that's where you currently are. The people who are responsible for inflicting Keir Starmer and his cronies on this country are the Tory party. They abandoned their voters, as you said. Forget the size of the majority. That is essentially an esoteric result of the first-past-the-post system. We know Keir Starmer won fewer votes than Jeremy Corbyn.
But that is the system we live under, Zia Yousef. We know that this is the system that we live under. You're not going to change the electoral system from opposition. Is it really realistic to say that you're going to come anywhere close to being in government? Look at the Liberal Democrats. They took decades to get even to be the junior party within a coalition. You've said at your conference last week you want to follow the Liberal Democrats' strategy of winning seats. Does that mean in 40 years you might be the Deputy Prime Minister?
Where we are now, Tom, is we live in a very different world to the one of years and decades past. We see things happening in the political arena across the world, including and especially in Europe, where we're seeing voters have never been more likely to switch votes relative to the previous election. And let's look at the actual numbers. Again, the 5 seats we won were a result of the first-past-the-post system. We won 14% of the vote share. And what I will say to people who support reform or are minded to support reform, we've demonstrated we can win seats, and also the seat return going from 14 to the 32, 33% that we need will be huge as a result of the system that we're in. It'll actually work in our favour in the next leg of the journey. And look at what happened in Europe. Marine Le Pen, very different politician to Nigel Farage. I want to be clear about that. She went from 17 to 34% in France in 2 years. That is unprecedented. Look at the betting markets. The betting markets have reform at 7-1 to win the most seats in the next general election. That's narrowed from 8-1 prior to our conference last week. And by the way, do you know what they have the Liberal Democrats on?
Betting markets aren't always a predictor.
Well, they had the Lib Dems on 100-1.
Betting markets aren't always a predictor. I'm going to ask you about professionalisation now. This is your task as new party chairman to change the party, change its run, how it's run. Can I ask, is that why that Nigel Farage's long-term spin doctor, Gawain Towler, was sacked this week?
Well, look, we're in the process of professionalising the party. That's an internal personnel matter. Obviously, wouldn't be appropriate to talk about that publicly. What I will say is Gawain has been an incredible servant to the party. He's done a huge amount to get the party to where it is. And if you look at his commentary on Twitter, you will see that he continues to support our cause.
It's interesting because very few people have a bad words to say about Gawain. They said he was, or basically everyone has said that he was such an effective operator. I'm a bit confused about the decision.
I have not a bad thing to say about Gawain either, but as I said, it's an internal personnel matter. I'm sure you appreciate it's not appropriate to talk about those things publicly.
OK, Zia Yousef, chairman of Reform UK, thank you so much for joining us here on the Camilla Tominey Show. Well, up next, we're going to hear from our final Tory leadership candidate, Robert Jenrick. Back with that interview in 3 minutes.
Welcome to State of the Nation, daily plunge into the stories shaping our country. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, and Monday to Thursday, we bring you the insights, the facts, the truth about how our country is being governed. Because what happens in Downing Street matters down your street. Tune in to State of the Nation every Monday to Thursday, 8 to 9 o'clock. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Headliners, Tomorrow's papers tonight, every night from 11 p.m.
Shakespeare play is axed after director refused to remove pro-transgender and pro-Palestine references in new take on A Midsummer Night's Dream. I went to see A Midsummer Night's Dream at Kew Gardens this summer, and it was brilliant, and they didn't touch it. They just left it as it is. And really, when you look at the plot of A Midsummer Night's Dream, it's essentially about sexual assault by today's standards. There's a lot of...
You mean bottom and all that?
Yeah, giving people potions so they'll do things they wouldn't have done otherwise. And I thought,
I was enamoured of an ass.
Yeah, exactly. And but they didn't alter the script, and it was brilliant, and I thought it was really, really good. On the other hand, this director, Steph O'Driscoll, known for her work in London's Royal Court Theatre, had a bit of an issue because she's put some very political stuff into her version. And of course, I would argue for her in that she can do whatever she likes. I'm all for creative freedom, but there comes a point where you're like, well, is it still Shakespeare then?
Yeah.
His version definitely wasn't pro-Palestine.
Yeah, I don't remember the pro-Palestine, pro-trans bit.
But the truth is these two things do not go together, trans right and free Palestine. I think the Gazan people are not so gung-ho trans rights stuff.
How dare you, Luke?
So,
Queers for Palestine is a legitimate movement.
So even if it isn't, she's allowed to make something that's incoherent to you. Sometimes you make things that are incoherent to other people.
And you know what? The people out there hear what I say.
Because so the management, the one thing I sympathise with is that they tried to shut it down after the preview. They said you've had all these months, and then they saw one preview and they sort of, whoever was running it went, well, change all that. And they were like, well, no, it's too late. You could have changed it at any point. But then the director walked out and the whole thing just fell apart, right?
Well, you don't know what the real thing is. It might be that this is how they get attention for the play. Now we're paying attention to this, and we're all going to go to this theatre in Manchester.
We're totally going to watch it all together.
So cynical.
GB News, the People's Channel.
Hi there, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm going to take a second to tell you all about my show, Dubes & Co. We start off with the issues of the day. We then bring in both sides of the arguments. We get rid of the disrespect, and then you throw me into the mix. And trust me, I'll tell it exactly how it is. And then, of course, the magic ingredient, you at home. We mix it all together, and what have we got? In my opinion, the best debate show in town. Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show with me, Tom Harwood. Earlier, I sat down with Robert Jenrick, Tory leadership candidate. Let's take a look. Robert Jenrick, can you name something you think the new Labour government has done well since coming into office?
Well, look, I'm pleased that they are turning their attention to how we get more homes built in this country. We need to build homes. We need more industry and infrastructure. Unfortunately, they're going about it in the wrong way. They're doing precisely the opposite of what I want to do. They're slashing the housing targets in the big cities, and they're hiking them in the countryside and in places where there isn't demand for housing. So the idea is right, but the policies are wrong. If I was leader of our party and ultimately Prime Minister, I want to get young people onto the housing ladder with serious but radical changes to our planning system.
Can you imagine backing any policy that Sir Keir Starmer puts forward in the House of Commons?
Yeah, I've already said that the NHS needs reform. And if Wes Streeting and Keir Starmer come forward with genuine reforms in the national interest that improve productivity so that we actually talk about outputs, not just inputs, I would support them. Now, I'm sceptical because the revealed preference of this Labour government is to cave in to the vested interest, to the trade unions. But I've made that offer to them. I think the public want to see their opposition behave in a mature way. Where there are good things, support them. Where they're making mistakes, like taking the winter fuel allowance away from 10 million pensioners, vigorously oppose them.
Now, in the 2019 leadership contest, all the questions were asked about their personal history with regard to drug taking. It became a bit of a farce, really. We heard lots of different stories from lots of different candidates. I'm going to ask the same question to you now. Have you ever taken illegal drugs? Keir Starmer said he had fun at university. What do you think that meant?
I don't know. We have to ask Keir Starmer. He doesn't look like the kind of guy that had a lot of fun at university.
OK, we're going to turn to the Conservative government of the last 14 years now. What was the most conservative reform that you think was actually achieved under those 14 years?
Probably the welfare reforms that happened in the early days under Ian Duncan Smith and Esther McVey. I thought that was morally right, making work pay, getting people off welfare back into the dignity of work, and obviously right for the economy. One of the things I've been talking about in this leadership election is we've got to do exactly the same now, because there are millions of people in our country who are on welfare. We need them to get back into the workplace. And that is also one of the ways in which we end mass migration, because we don't want companies to be reaching for the easy lever of foreign labour, bringing people into our country for whom we don't have the homes, the public services to look after them, and which makes it much more difficult to build the united, cohesive country that I want to see. So a proper Conservative agenda on welfare reform is essential.
So welfare was the most right-wing thing you think the government did. What do you think the most left-wing thing that the previous government did was?
I think probably the mistake of not being reformers. Look at something like the NHS. We became obsessed by boasting about the amount of money we were putting into it, not what the actual experience was for the patients. We treated the NHS like a religion to be worshipped, not a public service to be reformed. We've got to change that. I want a small state that works, not a big state that fails.
There were, of course, 5 Conservative Prime Ministers over the last 14 years. Some lasted longer than others. Who do you think was the best?
Well, I think that's very hard to say. I served as a minister under each of those 5 Conservative Prime Ministers, all very different people. I think that if I look back on that period, my greatest regret is that none of them had a very clear sense of where they want to take this country. That is what I want to do. What I've been using this leadership election to do is have a clear diagnosis.
I'm going to press you for an answer
and be clear about
of the most effective, the best, your favourite of the last 5 Conservative Prime Ministers.
I think I'm not going to answer that, Tom, because I think they were different people. I think Boris got Brexit done, a great achievement, which will be a lasting reform to our country. But look, all of them had their strengths and their weaknesses. What I want to do is learn the lessons from that period and put forward the serious answers to the big challenges that are now facing.
OK, you've named Boris. Let's dive into something that has popped up into the news this weekend. Would you have asked your advisors in Number 10, were you Prime Minister, to round up the army, potentially invade the Netherlands and grab vaccines that the UK had procured that the EU was holding back?
Well, I do remember the frustration at that time. I remember sitting in meetings and in cabinet meetings where we were discussing the issue that we had vaccines that we had ordered in other countries, which we were not, for a period of time, able to get back to serve our own people. So there's a serious point belying that.
But would you have called in the army?
Well, I don't think that's what Boris was suggesting. What I think he was showing was the immense frustration at that time that there were vaccines that we had procured which were not being made available for our own people. But the job of the Prime Minister is to put the interests of the British people first.
Boris Johnson has written in his book that he convened military leaders in order...
I wasn't privy to that conversation, Tom, so I don't know exactly.
Do you think in principle it would have been a good idea?
Look, I don't know the details of it, Tom. What I do know is that we managed to deliver the fastest and best vaccine programme in the world, and that is an achievement for Boris, for the Conservative Party and for the whole country.
Now, the Conservative Party and all leadership candidates are heavily critical of the Labour Party's position on winter fuel allowance. Under your leadership, will the Conservative Party really be backing a policy that takes taxpayers' money away from working people and gives it to many people who happen to be millionaires?
The issue here is twofold. One is the fact that Labour never said they were going to do this during the election campaign, so the dishonesty here, hiding this from the public. And the other point is the choice that's being made here. Keir Starmer is making a political choice to give money to his union paymasters, for example, £10,000 a year to train drivers who are already well paid, without properly settling the strikes. £8 billion to Ed Miliband's fantasy energy company, doesn't produce any energy whatsoever, and he's taking it from 10 million pensioners.
One might say the Conservative position here would be to do neither.
Of course, there are some people who are on good incomes, but there are also millions of pensioners who are not. And there are pensioners who are on as little as £13,000 a year, who this autumn and winter, when energy prices are on the rise, are going to be £600 worse off.
But are you really saying that as a Conservative Party leader you'll be supporting universal welfare rather than targeted welfare for people if they happen to be older?
Those issues very carefully. The difficulty with means testing is always that it is immensely difficult to do that in practice, and often even more expensive to means test than to provide it universally. So it's harder than you might imagine. But the point here is Keir Starmer's making a choice. I think it's a bad choice, a selfish choice, and it reveals a lot about his personality and his politics. Giving money to placate his union paymasters, taking it away from poor pensioners. I think that's shameful.
Well, the Times this weekend has alleged that your campaign did not want you to be questioned by Camilla Tominey during this conference. How do you respond to that allegation?
That's not true. You know me, Tom. I submit myself to interviews by people like yourself every day. In fact, I've done more interviews than any other candidate on this leadership contest. So I think I've done as many as all of them combined. I've done over 100 events where I've been meeting members in all 4 nations of the country. I've been on Camilla's show multiple times this year, have the highest respect for her. What I actually want to see is we candidates for this important job subjected to the highest degree of scrutiny. That's why tomorrow I'm holding my own event where members can ask me questions, where I'm going to set out my vision for the future of our party and our country.
Robert Jenrick, thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much.
Well, that was me speaking to Robert Jenrick a little bit earlier this morning. But what a show it's been. This is the kicking off moment of Conservative Party conference. Rishi Sunak, of course, leaves this conference tonight. Yes, he's only here for one day. He's the nominal leader of the party, but he's scurrying off without making a big speech on the main stage. Clearly, where all of the attention will be is on those 4 people who were interviewed, those 4 Conservative MPs who were interviewed on this programme. They will be making the waves over the next 4 days. And it could well be that there is a more clear frontrunner by Wednesday than there really was at the start of this week. To some extent, there is all to play for in this Conservative leadership race. 121 Conservative MPs vote until the final 2 candidates are arrived at, and then it's out to the membership. Could this be the moment where things become clear? Could this be the moment where someone really does pull ahead? And perhaps the biggest question of all, does it really matter if they do? This is a party that has a tiny number of members of parliament in the House of Commons, the fewest in its long and illustrious history. Does who leads the party really matter, and can they rebuild in one term? There's a lot to discuss there. Of course, Camilla will be back with you next Sunday with her Boris Johnson interview, but thank you so much for your company today. It's been a delight.
We love making our audience big cash winners, and you really could be next. With £36,000 tax-free cash in your bank account. Imagine getting the call about that.
Angela, you've won £30,000.
£30,000 cash?
Yes.
Oh my God, I'm going to cry. That's brilliant news.
For another chance to win £36,000 in tax-free cash, text CASH to 63232. One entry costs £2 plus one standard network rate message.